Hello students, and today we are talking about color. Now, I'm going to be using this red, blue, yellow color wheel today. It's probably the most relevant one to use for mixing paints. There's also the CMY or the CMYK color wheel, which is mostly used for printing applications, but we might look at that one separately. Now, we all are familiar with the primary colors, the building blocks of color, and that we mix these together to get our secondary colors. So, yellow and red give us orange. Mixing together, yellow and blue give us green, and then mixing together blue and red give us purple. Now we can then mix these together in different kinds of quantities and ratios to get what we call the tertiary colors, these ones in between that fill out this circle that gives us the color wheel. So how do artists build a color scheme? It's usually through grouping together colors with a particular strategy on whether you want it to be calm and cool and fitting together nicely, or whether you want to use contrast and tension. So the first group we're going to look at is analogous colors. These are colors that sit next to each other on the color wheel. And it's a little bit like a high school classroom where we've got the same kind of people that might sit together and clump together, and they're pretty similar and they don't really mix with other areas. So we've got the jocks sitting over here, we've got the nerds sitting over here, we might have the cool kids over the other side of the color wheel. What happens is we've got these really similar colors with similar traits that are going to stick together. When we put them in a color scheme, it's pretty inoffensive. There's not much conflict. There's not much tension. It's a kind of calm and easygoing way of grouping your colors together. And you can see it here in Van Gogh's landscape here. This is like we're looking at the high school cafeteria, and all the greens and blues are sitting in those trees. We've got all the yellows and oranges that are in that wheat belt across the bottom, and in the top we've got these pale blues and purples heading into greens in there. So all these like colors are clumping together, and it creates a sense of harmony. It means that those areas are soft and natural, and there's not a whole lot of contrast and tension. So it's a peaceful way of arranging your colors together. Now, another way we can look at this is our warm and cool colors. So on this side of the color wheel, we've got our warm colors ranging from red through to orange and yellow. Warm colors will tend to advance in a picture plane and want to jump into the foreground. They can represent things like fire, sunlight, autumn, and they can also imply happy energy. They can be comforting, but also particularly in the red end of things, they can have a bit of emotional intensity. And here's an image by Frida Kahlo, and she's using predominantly those reds, but with the oranges and yellows as well. And this one does have that sense of brightness and intensity to it. On the other side, we have our cool colors, blues, greens, and purples. These colors tend to recede into the landscape and want to fade out into the background. Now, of course, they can represent things like sky, water, grass, and plants. And they can imply sadness or depression or night, but also they can be positive and have airy qualities. They can be fresh and cold. And in this image here by Cezanne, you can see all these cool colors that are building up the forest and the mountain. All the natural elements of this image are using those cool colors sitting really beautifully together. And then in contrast to that, the built elements are warm colors. So that's creating a really good way of distinguishing our natural environment from the built environment by contrasting the warms and the cools. So we can also group our colors in terms of complementary colors. These are ones that are opposite each other on the color wheel. So we've got our blue and orange, we've got yellow and purple, and green and red. Now they're called complementary, but actually when they are right next to each other, it gets tense and full on and vivid. And you can see here it's actually quite hard to look at when these so-called complementary colors are really, really fighting for your attention. Particularly when they are in even proportions and in even saturation, they're both as bright as each other, it can become really intense. So as opposed to our analogous colors, this is where there is a lot of tension going on. You can calm this down, or you can create points of interest by just changing the ratios and having just small areas of that complementary color to create a vivid highlight. And you can see that at work in this image here by Whistler. So it's a predominantly blue image, but there are these tiny, tiny, tiny little flecks of an orange light. So there's one on the boat in the foreground, and then I jumps across to the other side of the river where we can see another orange light in the distance. And so that's a really effective way of using those complementary colors to draw our eye into these tiny little focus points. And here we can see that this is a background of analogous colors with those little bursts of red across there that are really creating those points of interest, dragging our eye across those dots. Okay, so we've got our primary colors, we've had our secondary colors and how we can mix those together and use them. But you can also mix all three primary colors together to create a range of muted tones or neutral tones. So this is where we're looking at these kind of browns and grays, but you can see depending on the ratios that you mix them, you can have these greeny grays or pinky grays, and they might reflect some of the color schemes that you're trying to work with. Now there's a little bit of a shortcut here. Instead of using the three primary colors, you might choose just to use these two complementary colors, because as we know, purple is made up of blue and red anyway. So we can mix these two colors to get a range of muted tones in between. So if we go back to our intense saturated complementary contrast here, and we can then chill out that red. So I've added a little bit of green to the red, and that has calmed it down a little bit, so it's not as tense. It's still got that vibrancy that you get when you've got these complementary colors, but the visual intensity isn't so full on. It's called muting saturated colors. And here we go, I've muted the green down as well, and you can see it's really calmed things down. There's still the contrast there, but it's not as visually intense. This is called making a harmonious duad. So getting your green and gradually adding red, getting your red, gradually adding green, and it means that you've got these fantastic contrasts in color, but you're harmonizing them through using those muted tones in between. You can see here these are examples from Johannes Itten from The Art of Color. Those complementaries up the top, we've got those muted tones in between, and in that figure 29 below, where you've got those intense reds and greens, but they're harmonized by the use of those muted tones. So here we've got our saturated colors again, and I can mute them down, bringing them closer to the middle of the color wheel by adding some of those reds in there. Now we've got this little element of muted red as well, which is creating a point of interest, again giving us a sense of contrast but without the intensity. But if you want, you can have intensity too, and you can use saturated color with those muted colors. If you look back at this image again, we'll see that in the background, Carlo has actually used a muted green color, and so that is what's helping those red colors in the foreground to really stand out, to really have a brightness. So she's deliberately using that complementary opposite as a background color to give us a more vibrant foreground saturated color. So we've had a look at a few of these approaches using analogous colors for you want it to be soft and calm, or cool and warm, or then the complementary colors, which is going to give us more of a contrast and more visual intensity. There's a few others that you can try. Things like a triadic color scheme, which is using three colors that are equidistant on the color wheel. You can use just your primary colors, they're always going to be equidistant, or your secondaries, or just creating that triangle around the color wheel. The tetradic color scheme is actually using two sets of complementary opposites. You can see in this example there is red and green and blue and orange, and that's going to give us a little bit of harmony in that we've got two colors from one side, but then also incorporating contrast with those two colors from the other side. And depending on the ratios in which you mix them, it could be a harmonious image with a couple of little highlights, or it could be an image with a lot of contrast. The other one we've got is a split complementary. So rather than using red and green, it's using green with the two colors either side of red. Now, a good example of this is probably this image here from Vincent van Gogh. Again, we've got a blue and green using in the background and coat, and of course the bright orange of the beard and some of the facial elements. So when we zoom in, we can see that in the face there's a dominant color scheme of the orange, and then using those kind of little bluish greens to contrast, and in the background we've got bluish greens with our flecks of orange to create this real visual intensity. Now let's go back to our muted colors, and don't they just sit nicely together? They are so harmonious together because they all contain those same ingredients of those three primary colors, just in different ratios, in different proportions. And so naturally they're going to really complement each other. And so this is a really great way of harmonizing or unifying any image, is by using some muted colors that relate to each other. But if you go too similar, they can get really grey, really brown, and that can be a little bit boring. But muted colors can also still contain some of those elements of our primary and secondaries, and still have that vibrancy, but just turning down the saturation so that they're not as intense. And when the saturation is lowered, they're going to sit next to other colors in a lot more harmonious kind of way. And let's face it, the colors that we actually see around us in the world aren't the ones that we see on the outside of the color wheel. They're always those kind of muted, natural colors, neutral tones. If we look at these illustrations from Chris Ware, we can see this great use of muted colors in most of the images that unify and harmonize it with some great little splashes of saturated color. So on the left hand side, we've got the red dress, the red pen, the red record button, and on the right hand side we've got these lovely beautiful muted tones in beiges and greens, and then the robes of the mums opening their Mother's Day present is a really lovely kind of spark of colour, and the two mugs on the bench behind as well. If we then look back to our old mate Vincent, now we talked about this in terms of using analogous colours, but if you look at this closer, you'll notice that these are all also muted colors. They're not those pure greens, pure yellows that you see on the outside of the color wheel. They've all been muted down with those complementary opposites using all three of those primary colors. What would this look like if it was in saturated colors? Well, I've done a quick Photoshop adjustment, and then it looks really garish when you're using just those primary and secondary colors that are on the outside of the color wheel. So using muted colors is going to harmonize and unify and help those color schemes sit nicely together. So come back to our schemes, and you can see how colors can relate to each other on the color wheel and using those ratios. But remember that you don't have to use them in those pure forms that you get on the outside of the color wheel. You can chill them out by muting them down, adding some of those complementary opposites or adding those other two primary colors so that you can get some calmer versions of them. Try out these color schemes. You can use little thumbnails, you can use pencils, gouache, or watercolor, and see how the feeling of images change depending on the kinds of color combination that you use.